Hello everyone, today we talk about high and low medieval European economy and more specifically that production destined to the market, right? So these products that were made essentially to be exported, to be inserted into this broader circuit of the economy that nor in the early Middle Ages had actually ever stopped. Today we don't really want to challenge this myth that we all know in fact to be false, that in fact intercontinental trades went on throughout all the Middle Ages, even in early medieval times. And of course the local economy was not as productive as it had been in fact in the late antique period, and what it would become in fact at this point during the high and low Middle Ages. But we cannot generalize it, especially we can't say there was not long-range trade. There was, just it was less vital than it had been before. Also there was no barrier of sort, like the political fragmentation and general instability of the system paradoxically didn't stop trade at all. You can blockade trade towards an enemy if you are a big country with some sound control, like a centralized system with a state, a bureaucracy, a kind of a good degree of territorial control that at this point is very rare. Not even powers like the Byzantine Empire or the Umayyad Caliphate or the Abbasid Caliphate managed to do it effectively everywhere. And therefore also wars that are seen as endemic usually, but if you think about them, they were overall rare as well, exactly because there weren't resources, and between a war and another, actually these powers, albeit remaining enemies, they kept trading in fact, and also piracy that, but it was always there. There was this extreme flexibility in a system that was very difficult to control, and for this reason very permeable. And that's very important to bear in mind. And also we that on Schwerpunkt now our medieval society playlist is pretty hefty at the point I can't even suggest you one video specifically. You can find plenty of them actually talking about the development of market centers and settlements, etc., seigneurial economy. We have already addressed actually a lot of these topics already. Today we go slightly more in depth about what was the production of stuff was sold out there that was not consumed locally, right? Because economy was largely a subsistence one, because of the very low crop rate and also the general even cyclical, if you want, unbalances of economy. Think about epidemics and famines and stuff like that, plagues. Did I already say epidemics? Yeah, sorry. But the Malthusian cycle in some ways that existed on a smaller scale, and surely the invasions. Lots of problems associated to that. But what I would like to stress always at this point is realizing how there is not like a stage where progress stops. Like if an era is particularly dramatic in outlook, and this was really much better, worse than others in by certain degrees. In reality, it's exactly the moment of crisis that sparks the necessity for creating a more competitive system that also has to rely on internal connections. So paradoxically, it's what we see as this stereotypically, not anymore historiographically, fortunately, as a closed system, the one with barter, the courtly economy, seigneurial economy, that where everything was around the manor, and not much the wider range, actually was exactly in this moment start to expand further, and requiring this broader coordination exactly to because if resources are precious and you can't waste them, you can't afford to waste them, well, that's a moment where you start managing them kind of well, right? And so the pulverization also of property in early medieval times brought this necessity of bringing things together, because that's more functional, right? and this would create later on some imbalances as well. But that's a system that is always evolving. But it's important to stress that this production for the market is the symbol, the proof of some good and great, actually, local care for these forms of production, right? So naturally, we have to take into account that in the high Middle Ages, society was, of course, almost exclusively rural. Production for self-consumption, let's say, was on the fore, right? And both from the sides, actually, of the great landowners and from the one of the peasants. That at this time, the latter is still being relatively free, right? Having kind of a large autonomy. And in the seigneurial system, a part of the cannons due by the dependent agricultures of the curtes, so the manor, could be essentially consistent to objects made by the same agricultures, right? We're talking about agricultural tools, wooden flatware, textiles, etc. And the landlord asked, in fact, in the properties where, because of environmental conditions, the workers of the fields didn't commit totally the peasants, right? So in areas where cannons were not just in agricultural products, but where the communities was already kind of specializing in the production of some more complex good. And the idea is that the landlords themselves, in fact, were aware that these goods could be put on the market, and that's why they were requiring them as well in the cannons, right? And the reason for this was naturally the need for cash, right? At this time, monetary circulation is not very lively, as you understand. It's somewhat still kind of rare. It does exist. It always existed also in here, but you start seeing progressively the increased need for this, particularly because with the same growth of the seigneurial system and the extension of some form of command over multiple territories that at that point maybe were more effective to organize and to control with actually paid services, chiefly military deterrence, than theoretically having this, cannons, these relations just left theoretically speaking. And the two things go in parallel, right? The economical development is all one here with seigneurial development and eventually the one of feudalism. And of course the local communities kind of agree because they need to be protected. They need someone in the absence of a strong central power in these centuries to effectively rule them and to protect them. And that's why also they agreed to give part of their product, the destined part of their product to this, because this made them also more competitive themselves. I mean, from their own seigneury, and therefore the system in which they were framed, they could benefit, right, largely to be part of the strong ruler. Also, of course, this is kind of relative depending on how strong they wanted effectively their rulers to be. But the point here is still that there is a consensus. It's a reciprocal form of organization that is established between the landowner and the peasants. In fact, the hypothesis that there could be this great agrarian business with seigneurial workers, and even in some sort of gynecea where was concentrated this numerous female labor of servile condition, is being sensibly redimensioned by Toubert, right? Did keep in their own service many specialized slaves / artisans, but this was especially to satisfy its own necessity. So even these larger communities that can be found these Mediterranean areas of great monasteries, especially the areas of Orthodox, these great Orthodox monasteries in the Greek Church, in the Orthodox Church, were organized like this in this more centralized fashion, but still within kind of their unit. Like, they didn't go far beyond like a far-reaching system where it obliged people to go living there. Simply, there were slaves, there were serfs, and some of them they had to live, and they had a kind of even worthy living in these factories because they were precious even. But this can be found also elsewhere in Central Europe. For example, in 822, in the Abbey of Cordoba in northeastern France, that was, by the way, one of the wealthiest, one of the most richest lands in Europe at the time, worked 6 tailors, 1 fuller, 6 smiths, 2 goldsmiths, 2 armorers specialized in shields, 1 parchment producer. That this is kind of interesting because parchment, that tells you how expensive that was. 2 shoemakers, 3 smelters, and 7 between carpenters or woodworkers, and bricklayers or construction workers. And this source actually omits meaningfully to name the textile workers, the weavers, and this indicates actually that the cloth were from to the abbey actually as already woven, right? So just to be refined by fulling, and Corby in fact received cannons in clothes from the properties that it owned in a not far away area of Picardy around Arles, Beauvais, and Amiens. And aside from the systematic existence of certain works, certain, let's say, factories, ante litteram, we could say, which was possible only close to the royal palaces, for example, where a lot of funds could be invested in. But the production of non-agricultural goods appears therefore not exclusively destined to self-consumption in general, right? We can always spot here in Carolingian Europe that there was some net, right, of traffics that went beyond the local dimension. And there were naturally also trade exchanges of objects on the long range that were characterized by also a very high qualitative level. This is typical. Like, luxury product has always been kind of at a larger range for the obvious reason that elites are kind of rare. They rule into different areas, and also they have the money to buy also for the costs attached to, in fact, travel, transport and all this stuff. So in this, the archaeological sources are particularly clarifying, at least in certain regards, for what concerns the most lasting material, right? And this is naturally not possible, at least in rare cases, for textiles, and also for other, for hides, for example, because they, as organic products, they tended to decompose, and it's very rare. At least there are certain conditions you can still find them preserved, but archaeology is already very complicated on its own, in the sense that it's very rare to find a kind of a very well composed picture. We find things by chance, and they're very difficult to track them back, let's say, as where they have been produced, where they came from, but still we can understand a lot from this. And we know, for example, however, that the preparation of clothes of wool, for example, and also of linen, was carried out everywhere, right? But if there is at least some knew that the clothes and the leather goods were coming from other places, this indicates a specialization in this sector. The consumption of hides and furs for clothing essentially, and footwear, and also for a multiplicity of other uses, was very large. Especially the source of supply of the hides was especially local. But we don't lack signals of trade of luxury furs, especially since the 11th century, which is this moment in which, as you know, that there is an intensification of production. There are also more sources available, and from which we can trace this trend, but that shows also that this commerce already existed before, right? That this trade already existed in previous times, was just intensifying now. So the ovine skins worked in Cordoba, for example. The Cordobans were imported in Merovingian times, so before the essentially the first half of the 8th century, to Marseille, and from here into northern France. So these are very early times, and this is kind of a long trade route if you think about it. Even in two different worlds that also had kind of problems with at one point with one another, because the Franks and the Visigoths weren't particularly fond of each other. Eventually also the Muslims arrived. However, the Cordobans here, this ovine skins were called in fact that way, which tells you how important the city was in this business and was specializing into it. It's part of a Iberian tradition in the tanning activity that went on with the same caliphate. For example, in the 12th and the 13th century, the originals and their imitations were spread all over the Mediterranean, right? And the term Cordoban, actually, in a city like Genoa, even qualified the leather maker himself, which is kind of amazing, right? So we're talking about like half of a millennium later, and still Cordoba was so famous for specialization into hide making that the average hide maker was known as the Cordoban. Right? That's very important. And still, there was all these. There were imitations, right? Which means that these products were still pretty appreciated at the point that it would be copied at one point, and that still bore the name of Cordoba. And relatively to the textile sector in the Frankish area, we know that between the 8th and the 9th century, certain textiles known as pallia fresonica, that is the Frisian mantles, basically, enjoyed a great fame. These were made of wool, and they came from this region, was around the North Sea, occupied by the Frisians. And these pallia, dyed in white, blue or red, were perhaps in fact mantles proper, and they constituted the main, at least the most refined piece of clothing that the Carolingian sovereigns disposed of. And this is particularly meaningful because if I'm not wrong, even certain diplomatic gifts up to Baghdad, Baghdad from the side of the Carolingians, had this kind of stuff, because it was considered in there together with horses and a few relatively rough things, but the Carolingians got from Baghdad were water clocks, extremely complicated advanced things. The Carolingians sent horses, textiles, things that, however, mattered at this point. And the same Carolingians evidently considered an imperial good. And it's interesting because Frisia also, that had been the seat of these quite, the Carolingians had never been fond of the Frisians. They crushed them themselves at one point, but still here there was a flourishing market on the North Sea, and eventually it would be also the Viking era. So this tells us how important and how early, 8th, 9th century, right, this specialized production in Frisia was. And it seems that in fact the same Charlemagne and Louis de Pius gifted with these pallia, as we've seen. And there's been a long debate about the effective origin of these mantles, because it could be Frisia proper, actually, that in fact comprehended that territory that would eventually be known as the Flanders, right? That, as we will see later, and famously enough, they specialized in textile production. They were the greatest producers in Europe. But it's possible that this Pallia Fresonica actually came from England as well. It's likely that the Frisians, that were in the first place merchants that trafficked between the coasts of the North Sea, kind of harvested, collected these clothes in the respective areas of production that could be both in Frisia and in England, and quite likely in both of them, right? And hence they were called Frisians because it maybe was the Frisian merchants that sold them, not because maybe there was maybe they were more produced in England even. Wool, as you know, would be exported later into the same Flanders as such, and we don't know, because Frisia frankly was quite of a depressed area, especially in the northern part, which most of the Frisian element was concentrated. Eventually the Flanders are kind of a bit more Frankish in part, Frankish influence. But let's say, aside from this, this tells you about the complexity even of tracing certain origins. And in Ireland are witnessed in the 10th centuries tributes in textile and in mantles that were exported, for example, by the Norwegian conquerors. So the Vikings, in that case, exported this Irish, these Gaelic clothes, right? And they started to profit also, as you understand, more than Ireland, that also wasn't particularly bright at the time for wealth. So it's also very fascinating that probably such in such case, they I'm not saying that there was a forced requisition of these goods, etc. It's too brutal to think that this could be functional, but still there were certain political events that also triggered the same the same exports, and the fact that just that the Carolingians crushed the Frisians that's kind of meaningful in some ways. I'm not aware of connections. It would be interesting to study these wars from in terms of local exploitation of economical resources and how this evidently influenced local production, because also elites were different. As we've seen before, these were usually expensive clothes, and therefore their production is not just this wasn't just the local farmer that produced them. Maybe just not just the best ones. Maybe there were other types, of course, but this seems to be a luxury market that was pretty flourishing in correspondence with certain dominations as well. Another area that produced textiles was Provence, in southern France, where Arles, a very important city in late antique and early medieval times, and also a bit also later, of course, constituted the principal center of the principal sorting center, we can say. There were many cities that made their fortune in this sense, not just as producers, but as mere sorting centers, as trade. If you think about how the Champagne fairs in the north would develop, right? They were already kind of wealthy areas, but they were essentially becoming richer and fatter because of the great trade routes that crossed them. And Arles, as you know, is in the Rhone Valley, so this was the area from Marseille, for example, as we've seen before, that were importing the Spanish clothes, channeled all the Western Mediterranean imports through the Rhone Valley into northern France, where the big kings were at this point, and keeping alive this. And it's kind of a obliged passage in there, because there are not many other crossings, and some of them are at least less profitable in part. So the Provençal Paglia, that in Latin are found also here as a name, are witnessed between the 6th and the 9th century. This is a very early date, and the importance of the textile also for textile production in the area in the low Middle Ages in a quite similar way is actually very similar to the same one of Frisia/Flanders as it would evolve later on, right? Even albeit at a kind of a lesser level, because the lowlands would become at that point like the main center. But even these areas seemingly had this similar role. Eventually, in the 14th century, changes in the trade routes caused a bit of a mess. So southern France progressively lost importance. But this was also a very wealthy area because of this long-range trade. Albeit we don't actually have a clear idea whether there was an actual continuity into this. Like, these are news that we find scattered across the centuries, but we don't know maybe if one war or one event, maybe for one century, had put this system in crisis. Of course, geography doesn't end, so doesn't change so quickly. In geological eras, it's very different. But of course, politically speaking, there were similarities, and this area would still remain for trades quite vital, right? And we can see that was a somewhat rooted tradition in the centuries in southern France. Around the mid-11th century, the Flanders developed a wool textile production of high quality that was much superior than the one of the neighboring countries, that would be exported all over medieval Europe. And the motivation of such great success of the Flemish woolen exports is also to be attributed, aside from the demographic expansion of the region, that of course for those times technological standards meant also more people working, right? So more production. Part of course this was triggered by other factors for which these people on average were kind of wealthier also than the average Northern European, and therefore they could dedicate not to working the land only, but also producing these goods. And there is a further reason, though, that is in fact the insertion of within the commercial circuit of the North Sea and of the formation of a stable territorial asset under the Counts of Flanders. The Count of Flanders was one of the most important territorial dominations, actually, of the Western Frankish kingdom. It was more, in fact, in the French orbit, and it lasted for a while. It entered in crisis only in the 13th century, and political stabilization is very important for developing a florid market. War disrupts. It prevents from having kind of sophisticated organization being stratifying over time. That's also why certain areas maybe even had a higher potential didn't develop, because maybe they were theater of major conflict, right? And we can also spot certain technical improvements. For example, the introduction of a more complex loom actioned with paddles by professional weavers, that was counterposed to the domestic tool actioned by women at home. And the Flemish textile appears now as a urban specialized craft. In fact, it's very tied to the development of the same Flemish cities. And the city of Ypres, for example, was one of the major centers of the great Flemish production. Well, it was founded around the mid-11th century. It's also fascinating to see that these areas kind of found new cities. I mean, the norm in Europe was mostly expanding over pre-existing centers, mostly of Roman origin, right? The power of an area as the Flanders, from a demographical and economical point of view, is measurable also through the foundation of centers that were specializing into, not in self-consumption, because the urban center mostly developed with kind of secondary or tertiary activities, right? Not agriculture, even though these cities, of course, were on the top of the agriculture production, and that could allow the same city to be formed. But people who inhabited in there usually did something else. So, at the beginning of the 12th century, you find that the clothes of Ypres are renowned up to Russia. So here we're talking about essentially half a century, which a city is founded and has already is already famous for its textile production at thousands of kilometers away. Now, this is pretty meaningful. However, and this naturally happened through the east-west axis, and from the North Sea to the Baltic Sea, arriving up to Novgorod, and then from to the great Russian rivers, even down to elsewhere. And and be aware, in fact, that the success of textiles as a product, of course, means that even in Russia at that point there were elites. Thinking about the great merchant republic of Novgorod in itself, and its oligarchy and its economical power, and they enjoyed these products a lot, so that they knew about Ypres. That otherwise, I don't think in Russia that they knew much else about other cities. But this in around, but this is very meaningful by itself. So, and however, the spread of new textile techniques that allowed the working of certain swatches of regular height, let's say, was very low. Probably in the same epoch, they were known only in certain Germanic areas like Swabia. In Italy, it seems instead that the adoption of the more complex loom didn't happen before the 13th century. If at the beginning of the, let's say, the beginnings proper of the Flemish manufacturing expansion have to be found in the 11th century, the full development of this vast area that comprehended also today's Belgium and northeastern France happened between the 12th and the 13th century, like many other European areas, telling you the truth. Albeit politically divided among principates, and with the gradual shifts of the most important textile centers, the commonality of economical interests tied to wool manufacturers caused the association of 20, more or less, cities at the end of the 12th century into a league that lasted till the end of the 13th, through which the cities could control the policy of exports. Contemporarily to Flanders, the wool work developed in England with similar characteristics, albeit with a less commercial importance, let's say, which means that it was mostly, shorter range export, but it was still present, right? And it was kind of less competitive, simply also than Flemish one, because consider, that there were competitors, and of course these markets didn't have the aggressiveness of what would become like modern markets, etc. But still, there were these strong problems. In fact, this was a problem even with the Hanseatic League that started saying, okay, if you to entire kingdoms like England say, okay, if you don't buy the products of just one of our cities, we don't trade with you anymore. And at that point, the weaker one, commercially speaking, was the kingdom, right? Because these cities were already, well placed to keep earning anyway. So it was kind of a blackmail, right? Not very differently from today, because that's essentially how the market works. And a merchandise sector tied to the military physiognomy of high medieval society was the metallurgic one. Not surprisingly, and especially the one of production of weapons and armor. The Frankish swords were worked in the Eifel, in the region of the Rhine and of the Ardennes, and from here sold on the coasts of the North Sea, in Frisia and in Scandinavia. The Anglo-Saxon swords were imported in Italy, but also the Langobardia produced cuirasses, shields, swords, and lances. If metallurgy, to which we have to include also the goldsmith work, it owes much, let's say, to the Germanic tradition, the production of flatware and of glass objects and ceramic objects was transformed typologically from the Roman times. North of the Alps, in fact, it seems to lose every urban character and to become an ability typical of itinerant artisans. And this remained, even albeit, say, qualitatively differentiated into the Italic cities. This is very important because these, metallurgic activity and all these other, they were kind of tertiary production. When the Roman Empire collapses, and everybody kind of reverts to the agriculture to make it simpler. Albeit this is not, meaning that in Roman times there had been cities where this productions were, in fact, carried out in a kind of somewhat specialized fashion. Certain areas, traffic stop, the whole trade geography kind of changes. So, for example, people from Central Europe, from Germany, that was kind of a depressed area, start being itinerant because evidently they had more option to earn, like traveling around, than remaining where they, those ancient centers had been, right, to make money. In Italy, instead, the city does maintain its kind of central role for the production of these materials, to these products, which we have to add flatware, glass, ceramic, as we have said. The detachment of the cities of all the productions that we have named seems a common datum, usually of pre-1000 Frankish and generally Central Europe. It's less equivocal, as we've seen instead for Italy and Arabicide areas like Spain and Sicily, where the economical presence of the city survived, in spite of the demographic fall and the impoverishment of material culture of in the early Middle Ages. The Italian cities, but also some in the north, like the largest ones, for example, like Paris, Orléans, Marseille, Cologne, Mainz. These were all Roman cities, in fact. Remained the place where the landowner went in order to buy what could not produce by itself. That's why in Italy, for example, there's a kind of imperfect feudalism, because essentially the city never dies out. So even in Carolingian and post-Carolingian times, the city does maintain this commercial centrality, we can say. And this means also it was a great connection between the landlords, cities, through the cities, with also long-range trade. From archaeological diggings, we can observe the continuity of urban life in Italy that is, let's say, showed also for cities like Milan and Verona in the 8th century by literary evidence. For example, the praising of the cities on the classical model that show the permanence of the urban ideology in the Italian peninsula. Cities like Lucca, Verona, Milan, Pavia, Ravenna, Rimini, Naples, Salerno were cities with a residing population proper, even in the 7th, 8th centuries, where normally in the rest of Europe that's the moment where cities are kind of at the lowest, right? This is important because naturally Italy, it's in the Mediterranean, it's in the south, it's the area where first of all it's also more more fertile in part, but it's also richer per capita. So it's an area that is well connected in many ways to this broader long-range trade, and that's why the city maintains this importance. And the presence of new let's say corporations of artisans, aside from the problems whether they persisted institutionally speaking from the late Roman period, indicates, however, a strong demand for goods and services. For example, leather workers, soap makers, monnayers, fishermen, bakers, boatmen. These are all individuals that cannot remain in the sources in this area. In particular, in Lucca, that was the center of the Mark of Tuscany, and also an important stop of the Francigena Way, resided between the 8th and the 9th century specialized artisans also in production of luxury goods, like goldsmiths, coppersmiths, tailors, monnayers. And it has to be remembered how also in the case of prestigious episcopal and monastic seats, the continuity in the employment of certain ornaments for liturgical use and furniture of various kind existed. The most recent historiography on the society and economy of the early and high Middle Ages owes a lot much to archaeological finds that have allowed to widen the range of research, also of the most common objects. The more rich of implications at this point are the ceramic finds, because ceramic was was produced largely in series, like in large amounts. It's widely renowned how ceramic represents for the archaeologists, given the abundance of finds, this guide fossil per excellence. If in Roman times the import of pottery and of amphorae from a port to another of the Mediterranean had been the norm, and Africa resupplied largely Italy, during the early medieval centuries the production was essentially local. The early medieval ceramics, aside from information of artistic and decorative character, allow a analysis of great interest on the production and on the exchange, and not only of these specific objects, right, between these regions. The typological characteristics, in fact, that are peculiar of every area allow to track back the place of origin, and exactly because it was about products of daily use and in fact employed in such consistent amounts that they offer the possibility of reconstructing the productive paths, and also the commercial ones as a consequence, that can be extended to the economy of an entire region. And it's been also recognized how the appearance of new techniques or typologies of production indicates the presence of migratory currents, right, of artisans that went from place another in the Mediterranean to, because they were required evenly. So not just of communities that were capable of working for a specialized market, but also of cities that required specialized labor force in order to fill eventually certain gaps into their economy, and to, that obviously, expanding their commercial capability in a planned fashion, right, or at least in a way that could be known also from a place another of the Mediterranean, that specific worker was required there. So this shows markets were already pretty dynamic in this time. For example, if the quality of the ceramics was good, there was a spread of it also outside the center of production. Hence, this proves an economical vitality. In the center-south of Italy, in particular, there was a productive continuity, even if not typologically speaking, from the Roman times. For example, researchers have showed the importance of the role of Otranto on the strait between Italy and the Balkans, and of the Salento region between the 6th and the 11th century, where there was a sort of specialized production with a wide range of forms taken chiefly from Byzantine and Oriental models. And here we can observe a pretty evident technological fracture from the ancient world, right? Both morphologically speaking, in the products, and from a technical point of view in terms of production techniques. Furthermore, the absence of import ceramics indicates the contraction of the markets compared to Roman times at that point. Compared to the picture offered by continental Italy, Arab and Norman Sicily makes a case on its own, right? It's however difficult to distinguish, given the scarcity of sources, how much this difference has to be ascribed to the Arabs, or whether it's a Byzantine legacy, for example, in the island. And in the 11th century, Sicily is fully integrated into the Arab commercial circuits. it produced silk, for example, silk work at least, and linen and cotton textiles. And the in the close to the royal palace in Palermo in the second half of the 12th century was active Tiraz, that is a royal laboratory, which is kind of an Arab name, as you understand, even in Norman times, where this splendid silks textiles were produced, were worked. This was very, this was luxury products. Silk was used even in armor, telling the truth. And instead, after eventually the patrimony of technical as well as mercantile knowledge would be lost in favor of a rather prevalent ruralization that was oriented to the exports of agricultural supplies, of agriculture products. And this is important because it's as if this talked for a kind of a larger organization of Sicilian economy under the Normans. At the point, it was not just much of a local thing, of a luxury product just for the local elite, but it was trying to make of the whole system a big structure capable of maximizing profits. And Sicily was exported all over the Mediterranean. Like Italy exported. It's funny because in ancient times, the Romans imported grain from places like Africa and Egypt. Africa meant as Tunisia, of course. Instead, in the High Middle Ages, it's Italy proper that starts exporting food, not just to other countries, but specifically to same Africa and Egypt in itself, which is pretty amazing considering what the Nile Valley can do. So this tells you that it was a pretty florid market. In the meanwhile, the trade balance, in fact, was shifting from the Islamic world to the Christian one. So this passed chiefly through Italy at the beginning, and this powers of various type. It could be mercantile republics, but even entire kingdoms like the Norman one. So the archaeological finds of ceramics confirm the data offered by written sources relative to the textiles. If still in the 9th century the production of Sicilian ceramics was kind of at an autarkic level, by the end of the 10th century it reached a large refinedness that indicates the presence of specialized factories both in the cities like Palermo or Agrigento and in the countryside. This is particularly important as well because it tells you how connected the system was. It wasn't just about the city, it was also about rural communities and their working capabilities. The Sicilian pottery was exported up to Tuscany and Lombardy, and in part also to Libya and Egypt. Between the 11th and the 12th century, the production reached by sea the Tyrrhenian ports. Instead, in the second half of the 12th century, the production techniques kind of impoverished, and the manufacturers were reduced to serve again an internal market, even though with a different timeline for the various areas of the island. And in the second half of the 13th century, Sicily, by exporter of ceramics, became an importer, right? Contemporarily to the crisis of the Muslim element, interestingly enough, because during Norman Sicily, much of these crafts were in the hands of Muslims, right? At one point, they were, with the Swabians also, they were expelled in part, they were deported to Apulia. So it was that had an impact, and this partly, also never think that this system was necessarily all directed from the top. In part it was like that, but it's as if these countries were permeable, and there were certain trade continuities that evidently here we can track across the events like the Norman conquest and the Christianization of the island, which is very interesting because it tells you that the growth went on in spite of the fact that the government passed from the Arabs to the Christians, to the Normans in this case. So similar observations, such as the one that we have importantly highlighted for ceramic finds, can be offered also by glass products, a production that is witnessed throughout the whole Italian peninsula. And in fact, after the late Roman times, the glass pottery lost that character of luxury product that had characterized it, and instead it became a current use. Even in the typological impoverishment that objectively took place between the 6th and the 10th century. Now this is interesting because I was thinking that Rome in imperial times, it was largely a kind of a parasitary city. It was maintained by the rest of the empire, but one of the very few things that was produced in Rome, local factories, was effectively glass, right? And that was evidently a kind of a luxury production. So it's interesting that in medieval Italy instead, albeit the general material impoverishment of early medieval times, these products start being used by common people. That's particularly meaningful, but there could be many considerations we could make about it, because Italy sees between in fact exactly the 6th century onwards, where we start tracing this transformation, actually a massive structuration of local society. Think about the Gothic War, right? And the collapse of the Roman latifundia, and the fact that people were freer. They didn't maintain, in spite of the plague and everything, the highest wealth per capita in the world, but without kind of too high aristocracy, locally speaking, so that the freemen had largely kind of a greater, they were kind of better off. So instead of working as colonists in the latifundia. So you will see how even certain transformations are relative, right? And the for example, the finds of ovens for glass making in medieval times show us that some of them actually came from places. For example, actually they can be traced back as much as to the 7th to the 8th century. For example, certain areas around Venice, that was also a very interesting point, given that this time it wasn't developed like the city would become. It was still very well connected to Byzantine trade and trade with the East. Where here you find as early as this moment, in the 7th century, theoretically the darkest moment medieval, you find that glass making for glasses, for drinking. That's what I'm saying, and that could be used by everyone. So these people there, in the 7th century, already used glass for drinking. That's pretty amazing. And some of them though were also, however, still reserved to kind of more expansive, kind of more refined products. Like for example, the glasses for certain churches, but even mosaics are to be found in the same area for the decoration of churches. So you see here how really, if you think, when you hear those people tell you, our early medieval times were flatland, people starved to death, it was so bad, etc. Okay, this video was not about this specifically, just was observing how there was evidently something more than that, but also how the actual individual wealth, especially in certain areas of Europe, it was seen as basically Flanders, and even if a bit later, but especially Italy, and in the very early medieval times, was pretty impressive. And this has to be noted because it does acquire even a geographical meaning. Like it's not, there are certain continuities in Europe overall, but there are also certain areas that objectively have different histories, right? There are certain areas that you can't compare, that were also relatively close, right? It's not that Flanders was so far away from Saxony, let's say, but the first one was wealthy, the other one was poor. The same goes for Italy. From one side you have Lombardy, and from the other side you have the Balkans, which are completely a different story. It's plenty of these examples, but it's also fascinating to see this very long-range trade from places like from Spain, southern Spain actually, to northern France, which is a pretty long way. And naturally the connection with the Islamic markets that were transcontinental in places as we've seen now as Sicily, for example. But there would be more to add. Like if you take the whole Carolingian Empire, you see that they had some broader international trade interests that already at the time were quite important, and this would be maintained also by other emperors that came later. Like because at this point trade starts becoming really an important aspect of economy. And what I stress also in other videos is to let's say is observing how, like we say, Europe started reviving from the 11th century, right, and then it grew. But you see from this picture here that even before there was a development, that it was actually the very cause of what allowed in later centuries for us to observe like a magnifying thing. So talking about early medieval times in dark, gloomy tone, like it was so bad, it was so well. It also largely depends on which areas you're talking about, in which actual time, and there are areas that even progressed in this moment from actually previous poverty. For example, think about Flanders, think about the foundation of Ypres. Right, it's not that those had ever been particularly developed areas before. Flanders and northern Europe in general is meaningful because southern Europe had always been richer, thanks to my eyes. It was more fertile, was more connected to the international traffics. It was warmer. But what happens in northern Europe is that you find in early medieval times, in high medieval times, actually a growth from a situation that up to a very few centuries before was kind of one of the lowest in the whole continent. So it's impressive. It's also difficult to explain. Like today we talked just about the specialized production, but here you understand that there are big quantities, big dimensions involved that need to find an explanation. We'll try to give it in another context, maybe in another video, but they have to be taken into account because they can't just be left to it didn't happen by chance, and especially there were people who were actively working for this stuff. So of course it's also difficult because I personally don't know much about these topics, like what the actual sources are. In as far as I know from colleagues that study not archaeology but that work very close to it because they study early Middle Ages, so basically their method is much more similar to the one of an antiquist than the one of a a literary student like a low medievalist like me could be. But it's nevertheless very meaningful to observe that sometimes this data is very it's more than else is scanning. It's not that it's not meaningful in itself, but it's kind of narrow overall, and that's why archaeology also costs a lot. I mean, reading sources costs time, of course, intellectual resources, but everybody can do it. Finding new archaeological evidence is tough, is something different, it really requires a lot more of funds, right? And even, you know, if we had those funds, it doesn't necessarily, you know, there are so many complications about even this, where this stuff is found, the dating it, because that's an actual problem. You know, it's not that we know perfectly. Yeah, but even that is susceptible of criticism, because it's actually more based on certain styles and analogies rather than actual scientific datation, right? So it's sometimes misleading. Like I'm not like, this is the historian speaking versus archaeology, you know, because you should know that historians and archaeologists should be the same, very same people, just with different you know, competences, but doing the same job. That is not. We hate each other. I'm kidding, of course. We don't hate each other, but we do have a very different mind, and we generally distrust each other's work because we think that the other is too reciprocally, that we are too prejudiced in our respective fields, and there should be a bit more of coming together, in my opinion. But it's still like, there are still essential differences that are important, not much because of the object of studying, but also certain methodological implications of what these mean aside from the same discipline, right? There are two different philosophies, if you want. But this is another story. Okay, so for now I think we can stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.